Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to episode 49 of the podcast, where today we're going to be discussing the clue in the Crossword Cipher. So I know a lot of times in these episode intros, I say I remember the cover of the book and I don't remember the plot. It was similar for this book. I do remember carrying this book around with me a lot of times. I was one of those kids that would read books in restaurants while we were waiting for food, or I would take the books on vacation with me to read by the pool or in the car. And so I remember carrying this book around because it has a pretty memorable cover, but I didn't remember any of the plot within it. So The Clue in the Crossword Cipher is the 44th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1967. And you all probably know the drill by now, but if you want to see these book covers that we discuss on the podcast episodes, I always post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. So we've got just one book cover to discuss today, and this book is very brown in coloring, and it's got what looks like a big tree ring behind Nancy. It's got circles and letters. It's obviously a coded message, but Nancy herself is wearing this really iconic blue and green zigzag patterned sweater, and she's holding this relic of some kind. It's got a monkey on it, and it's got lines on it, and this mystery, I mentioned it in the last episode, but it has a lot to do with the Nazcan lines in Peru. And Nancy, of course, has her trusty magnifying glass that she's using in this cover, and she has the flipped out strawberry blonde hair. I don't know, I always liked this representation of Nancy. Like, you know, there's certain artists' depictions of Nancy that you're like, that's not really how I pictured her. This is pretty much exactly how I pictured her as a kid. So I came up with a couple of funny cover spoofs for The Clue in the Crossword Cipher, and the first one is Rosetta Stone for Advanced Linguists, because I think this is one of the very first mysteries where Nancy is really dealing with an ancient civilization. I mean, this thing is old, and just trying to decipher what these hieroglyphic symbols mean is pretty intense. And then the second cover spoof that I came up with is Nancy Drew and the mystery of the monkey manhole cover, because this thing is huge and you just want me to believe that you carried this around everywhere and lugged it around in your suitcase. I don't know. It's kind of sizable. But hey, whatever it takes to solve this mystery, right? Because if there's a universal truth that holds true in the Nancy Drew books and the Nancy Drew games, Nancy will lug around the heaviest of objects like it's no big deal. She's just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna carry this expensive, huge, ancient exhibit piece from this museum around like it's no big deal. So as far as giving this book a cover rating, I gave it 4 magnifying glasses because I've always really enjoyed this book cover. I don't know why. The colors in it, Nancy looks pretty much how I've always imagined her to look. She's got her magnifying glass. She just looks like she's ready to solve a mystery. So now we're going to jump into some of the characters that we see show up in The Clue in the Crossword Cipher. So first up, we have Carla Ponce, and she is from Peru, and her aunt and uncle are named Mr. and Miss Renshaw. There is a Harry Wallace, and I put in parentheses, fake police officer, Senor Velez and Luis Lozoya, and they are a shop owner and assistant. Manuel Sanchez, who is a thief at the hotel that Nancy stays at later in the book. Maponi, I believe is how you say his name. He is of Incan descent. Senor Diaz, who is the hotel owner, and Senora Violetta, who is the shop owner in the hotel. So now, without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis. Nancy is asked to solve the mystery of a monkey plaque by her new friend from Peru, Carla. It supposedly leads to treasure, but before they can even leave River Heights for Peru, a man claims to be a policeman and tries to take the plaque. Once the girls arrive in Peru, the antics continue with the plaque being stolen and later found in a gift shop, and then Nancy being carried away on a rogue ox. Villains come out of the woodwork and throw obstacles in Nancy's path as she tries to solve the mystery of Carla's long-ago relative, Aguilar. Eventually, it's discovered that there is a connection with the Nazcan lines, treasure is found, and the bad guys are taken down. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is Drew in Peru. Nancy Drew finds treasure at Nazcan lines, solves 300-year-old mystery. So in the last mystery we talked about, Nancy solved a dream that this lady was having, and now she's solving 300-year-old mysteries. It's like her mysteries get progressively cooler. So I wrote down a lot of notes for the clue in the crossword cipher, so let's discuss. So right off the bat, we have Nancy talking to this girl named Carla, and she is actually 18 years old like Nancy, and she says she has a mystery for her to solve involving a plaque with a monkey on it, and it's been in her family for over 300 years, and supposedly it leads to treasure. I don't know if you guys feel this way, but sometimes I like the plots that involve treasure and sometimes I don't, and so usually once that comes up I get excited when I'm reading one of these books, and then it depends on where the mystery goes. Like sometimes it's a good plot device, sometimes it's not. A perfect example of this is the revised edition of The Clue of the Broken Locket. I didn't like the aspect of treasure in that book. It felt thrown in and very lazy, but I loved it in Secret of Shadow Ranch. Then it made complete sense. So the next note that I wrote down is Carla got a note saying beware the cat. And I love when Nancy and the people she's solving mysteries for get threats and like notes and stuff. I don't know. That is so spooky to me. It's just 5-star. So the next thing that I wrote down is Carla trips, the plaque rolls down a hill and into the Muskoka River, and Nancy dives in after it. So this thing is made out of wood, so thankfully it floats pretty well, but it's huge in the cover of the book, and they talk about lugging it around through the majority of this mystery, and it's just, I don't know, like, why did Carla's ancestors make this plaque so bulky and awkward to carry around? Like, my theory was kind of that it would be easier to keep track of it and not lose it, but it's only been 5 minutes into this mystery, and we almost lost it just now. Thankfully, Nancy jumped into the river after it. So we have another moment where Nancy freaks out thinking that the plaque has been stolen and misplaced, but apparently Hannah Gruen hid the plaque for safety when Nancy and Carla were out doing something in River Heights. But Nancy panics until Hannah's like, oh no, I just put it over here in the bottom drawer of this credenza. And okay, I'm sorry, Nancy Drew, but what were you thinking? Like, every other thing that has been given to her to solve a mystery, she'll throw it out on the coffee table or whatever. It's like, this is a 300-year-old Peruvian plaque, and it's Carla's ancestors. Like, I think you should probably treat this with a little less levity than just your average trinket. But what do I know? I'm not the mystery solving expert here. So there's a man named Harry Wallace who claims to be a policeman, and he comes to Nancy's house and tries to take the plaque, but George judo flips him. So if there's one thing that I remember from Nancy Drew Mysteries, other than Nancy's crazy skills and George being mean to Bess, it's got to be that George will not hesitate to judo flip a grown man. I love it, because here we are in the foyer of the Drews' home and we're wrestling over this 300-year-old monkey plaque, and George just runs in and grabs this guy and just completely flips him. And I remember as a kid reading, whenever George would do that, I would be like, yeah, George, judo flip him. I had no idea what judo was, but I figured it was kind of like karate. Okay, this just in. According to Google, it is a Japanese martial art, and it says it is used to use the opponent's strength against them and force them to tap out. So basically what we did to Manette in Danger by Design, the computer game. So the next note that I have down pertains to Nancy and Ned, but Ned kissed Nancy goodbye at the airport, so I thought that was kind of sweet. Ned's a pretty good boyfriend. So Nancy, Bess, George, and Carla are going on this trip to South America, but of course they stop over in New York because they want to see Aunt Eloise. And Nancy, Bess, and George go see this museum, and they look at these exhibits on the Inca, and Carla and Aunt Eloise go sightseeing because she's apparently never been to New York. This really made me think of her interactive computer game, The Secret of the Scarlet Hand, because in that game, Nancy goes to this museum and she helps these curators, and it's about the Maya instead of the Inca, but Just kind of cool. It's the very next day that the girls get a phone call claiming to be the airline that they're supposed to be flying with down to South America, and they say that their flight has been canceled, but it's a hoax. I love how these hoax phone calls are such an integral part of the Nancy Drew mysteries, because if you were to do that now, you could very easily call the airline up or Google something and verify if it's true or not, but they use this a lot in the older mysteries. The next note that I wrote down is Carla says part of the plaque says mono cola, which you can actually see this on the book cover. They added this detail, which is so cool, but that apparently means monkey tail. So we're starting to try to decipher and decode this plaque because we think it leads to treasure, but Nancy's not exactly sure how the monkey plays into things yet. So it's at this point when Nancy and the girls go to a shop in Peru, and the man that owns the shop, Senor Velez, tells them that the plaque is made from this wood from the Arianes forest. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. But Nancy notices that his assistant, Louis Loaza, is sketching the plaque, and George rips up the drawing, and he gets very mad at her. So this Louis guy, suspect number 1. Obviously, this guy has designs on the treasure, and he overheard them talking, and he wants to find it for himself. So this next note that I wrote down is Nancy and the girls are at a museum, and they're just kind of taking it all in, and there's this couple. They're very obnoxious. I think they describe the guy as walking around with a cane, and they're just loud, and they keep gesturing and throwing their arms around, and it's like, you guys are around a lot of fragile, expensive things. And of course, they knock over a vase, and Nancy just happens to jump over and catch it in the perfect amount of time. Nancy Drew has the reflexes of a cat, whether she's saving priceless artifacts at a museum from toppling to the floor or small children who have fallen into a lake. So this next note that I wrote down, I said, okay, this has got to be the nastiest thing George has ever said to Bess. But Bess says there's been so much excitement she feels as if she'll burst, and George says, well, my dear fat cousin, that might be one way to lose some weight. All in favor of leaving George in Peru, say aye. Also, who talks to their cousin that way? That would be like me saying, George, my stupid cousin. Sometimes I really wish Bess would just give it right back to her. Now, this next thing that I wrote down, I don't know why I thought this was so funny, but Nancy tells someone hasta la vista. I think I thought it was funny because it's in italics again, kind of like the tacos were in Secret of Shadow Ranch. And just the fact that Nancy's the one saying it, I cannot unhear Arnold Schwarzenegger in my brain, hasta la vista, baby. So the next note that I took down is Nancy sees this man and this boy talking nearby, and there's this ox and a cart, and Bess wants to get a picture of it because it's cool. It's not something you see every day in River Heights. And the man who owns the ox convinces Nancy to get up on it for a picture. And then while she's up on top of this ox, the boy pokes the ox with a stick, and it takes off with Nancy on top of it. If you heard that song, Dumb Ways to Die, in your head just now, we could be best friends. And another thing, what did I tell you? Bess Marvin has become quite the photographer in the last few books. She is always taking pictures. So you know how I said earlier that Nancy should probably treat this 300-year-old monkey plaque with a little more respect? Well, she left it in their hotel room, and they get back, and it's missing. But then when they start searching around for it, they actually find it on the wall of the gift shop downstairs in the hotel. And the shop owner says someone named Manuel Sanchez took it and sold it to them. And so by the description of this man, he's the same man who encouraged that boy to poke the ox with a stick. This part of the book I didn't really understand. I was like, I know you're trying to make things harder for Nancy to solve this mystery, but did you just take a quick sketch of this thing and then just decide to get rid of it? Because it would be more valuable to you to just take it instead of, I don't know. He got a little bit of money from the gift shop owner, but I'm like, wouldn't this thing be more valuable if it supposedly leads to treasure? I don't know. We never said that villains were the brightest in the crayon box. So the next thing that I wrote down is the girls are taking this boat to this forest where the wood that the plaque is made of comes from, and I thought for sure that the boat was going to sink, but instead it stops and the gas line gets clogged. This was a nice little twist because usually the boat sinks or the boat gets hit by another boat, and so just the fact that the gas line got twisted up and clogged. So they have somebody on the ship work on it, and then it says all the Spanish passengers are like, "Ole, ole," when they get it working, and then the Americans are like, "Yeah." I mean, if I had somewhere important to be and I got stuck on a boat like that, I'd probably be cheering too. So this next note is just funny because I was mispronouncing this. Like, I read it one way. Do you ever do that where you read a word and then you're like, this is not how it's spoken? I thought it was Diplodocus. It's Diplodocus. It's these dinosaurs, the ones with the big long necks. But Nancy starts talking about dinosaurs, and I guess because they're in this old forest, and she's like, oh yeah, they used to eat the trees in the forest, and Bess says Diplo who, and all I could think about was the DJ Diplo. But turns out it's Diplodocus. I learned how to pronounce another word today. I mean, your girl doesn't have the best track record. I used to think as a kid that physician was pronounced physician. So, live and learn, y'all. Live and learn. That's why we read, right? So, Nancy has her first injury of the book. She gets hit with a rock square in the back, and it's Manuel Sanchez that threw it. The same guy who poked that ox with the stick, or should I say, convinced that small child to do it for him. Nancy has rocks thrown at her a lot in these books. So, this next part is where things get a little bit sketchy with this mystery solving. So, Nancy's resting because, she's been hit with a rock, and that's always what they suggest to Nancy is like, oh, just go lay down and rest, even if you've been hit in the head. And Carla dresses up and goes to the casino in the basement of the hotel to try to get a lead on Sanchez. So do we see where this is going? This is not great. I mean, the girls are 18, so they are of age, but going down to this casino where all these strange men are and Nancy's asleep, I mean, granted, mysteries don't go perfectly even when Nancy is around, but whenever she's like out and down for the count, it seems like really bad things happen. So Carla dresses up really nice. It says she looks really beautiful. She's wearing a pretty dress. So she goes down to this casino. I'm just picturing this place like dark and filled with smoke, like really creepy. And Bess is her wing woman. Now, don't get me wrong, Bess Marvin would be an excellent wing woman, but it's just a recipe for disaster. So Carla approaches this man, and he says he'll take her to Sanchez, and she agrees, but then she changes her mind because she starts to, I think it's like her common sense kicks in, and she's like, I probably shouldn't get on a boat with this guy. And so the man tries to force her onto the boat, and Bess screams and scares him off. And a lot of people come to Bess and Carla's aid, but I mean, we almost witnessed Carla being abducted, which is super scary. And although their methods weren't that smart, their efforts don't go unrewarded. They do get a lead on a guy named Frederick Wagner. Now, the next note that I have down, what did I tell you? So earlier in the podcast, I think I talked about a door of a plane coming off. I remember this so vividly as a kid. I didn't remember what book it was in. Well, it's in this book. So the door of the plane Nancy's on opens and she almost gets sucked out of the plane. Alaska Airlines, anyone? But then the door completely comes off and hits the plane's fuselage. So not only is there just this open cabin, but now the plane's going to go down because it's losing gas. And the book also says that these two men pull Nancy away from the door and are able to pull her to safety. Like, that is not how that would work. You would be just sucked right out of the plane. But thankfully Nancy isn't, because then we would have no more mysteries, and they're able to land the plane safely. The next thing that I wrote down is Nancy and the girls are worried about being an imposition on Carla's father, Senor Ponce, because they want to go to Machu Picchu. But he just says, don't worry, I'm rich. Okay, then. I love that Carla's dad is just like, whatever, I have all this money, just go do whatever you want to do. Something tells me that this family is not going to be very impacted by finding this treasure. Like, reconnecting with an ancestor, that's cool, but as far as will it help them monetarily, apparently it doesn't matter. So Nancy, Bess, George, and Carla go to tour this palace, and Luis Loaza, the guy who was sketching the plaque at that shop earlier in the book, follows them there, and George just stares at him until he leaves. That had to be the most awkward staring contest in the history of ever, but if anyone's capable of it, it's George Fane. Now, the next note that I wrote down, this has to do with some of the souvenirs that Nancy buys, and she apparently bought a salad bowl set for her dad and jewel cases for Hannah and Aunt Eloise, so I thought that was really sweet. I love how when Nancy is solving these mysteries and she's facing imminent danger, she still somehow manages to find the time to find the perfect souvenirs for people back home. And Nancy, Bess, and George also buy some traditional Incan clothing, and I didn't have too much of a problem with this. You know, in Secret of Shadow Ranch, the girls wore quote-unquote squaw outfits, and it was just kind of done in a weird way. I didn't really like it, but Nancy, Bess, and George bought these outfits, and it seemed pretty respectful. Now, it's at this point in the mystery when the girls go to meet Mapani, who is of Incan descent, and there's an earthquake. And when they go back outside, there's a boy laying in the street, and Mapani translates what he's saying, and he says, "Cat, I must stop. The sun god has sent this sign," and then he runs away. So if you remember the threat that Carla got before they even left River Heights, it said, "Beware the cat, El Gato," so this ties in. And Nancy wants to go after the boy, but Mapani tells her it's no use, he's already gone. But he does take them to some ruins called Sacsayhuaman, I believe that's how you say it. But Nancy climbs up the ruins, and she sees a man painting a red cat face. And the person tries to throw the paint at Nancy, and she's forced to jump off the top of these ruins. It's like, stay right there and get hit with this heavy paint can, or jump down several feet. But it's just like, I can almost feel it, like when you've jumped from too far of a height and you really hurt your feet and legs. It's not good, but of course Nancy's okay. The next note that I have down is what else but George being rude to Bess, and she's reading these tips at the hotel about how to deal with altitude sickness because they're way up high in the mountains. And she said, "Here's some information for you, Bess. It says eat light meals." And then George tells Bess again to eat light meals in Machu Picchu. I'm just like, what is it with people who feel the need to like govern everything that goes in your body and in your mouth? It's like, just leave her alone. George takes all the fun and joy out of vacations. So buckle in because it gets worse, but there is an alpaca that comes up behind George at the hotel restaurant, and it scares Bess. But Bess ends up, she says, "Oh, I want a picture on the alpaca because it's your vacation. You want to enjoy your vacation and remember it." And I don't blame her for wanting to get a picture on this alpaca. But it sits down and refuses to stand when she's on it. And then Mapani says, "Miss Marvin, you must weigh more than 100 pounds, and that's all an alpaca can carry." Now, I really don't like when George is rude to Bess because George is just completely tone deaf and tactless. But I'll give Mapani the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's a cultural difference. Maybe he's just, stating a fact. I mean, I don't know anything about alpacas, but I just think it could have been handled so much better and so much more delicately, just being like, they could have taken Bess's picture and then not even mentioned anything. Like, it was just rude. I think the mentioning of specific weights can be really triggering to people, and that's why I put a trigger warning in the content and show notes for this episode. But I just wonder, like, how many issues did this give young girls? I mean, I might be able to dismiss this if it weren't so constant. This happens to Bess in every single Nancy Drew book, and some are worse than others. But I feel like this is a topic that is not discussed as often as it should be with the Nancy Drew books, but this probably created some body issues for a lot of girls that are now grown women. And that's really unfortunate to me, and that's why I try to call it out and combat it in all these episodes. Like, I feel like brushing it under the rug is the worst thing you can do. I mean, we've talked about Bess being fat shamed on this podcast. We've talked about the racial issues in the Nancy Drew books, and I feel like I would be doing a disservice if I were to just kind of, candy coat some of those issues. So, and I'll be the first to tell you, I love these books, but there are some things like that I have problems with. So I just, it's awkward to talk about, but I think it's something we need to talk about. Anyways, sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but thank you again for letting me share my thoughts on this. So the next note that I took down is Nancy almost is pushed over a cliff by a rolling bundle of thatch thrown by Louis Loaza. So we've been hit in the back with a rock. We almost got hit with a paint can at some ruins, and now we almost got pushed off a cliff, so this is great. So the next note that I have down is a little bit problematic, but Bess gets hit on by this aggressive guy. He just keeps coming on to her, and it's honestly really gross. Gosh, now that I'm reading these notes back, this book, I thought it was going to be much better, but it was kind of hard to read in parts. So the next thing that I have down is Bess does something incredibly foolish but also brave. She goes back to the hotel to protect the plaque, and she sees this file coming through the crack in the door. So someone is actively trying to break into their room. and she pulls it into the room, and the person gets mad and bangs on the door and leaves. But this scene was super tense because it could have gone so differently. I'm glad Bess had the forethought to go back to the room and protect the plaque, because they just leave it out in the middle of the room. But I was also kind of scared for her, because if someone broke in, I mean, they probably would have hurt her just to get to the plaque. So it's finally at this point in the mystery when Nancy gets another lead on this plaque, and she meets this man named Ponce, who gives her more clues, and he suggests that she check out the Nazca lines. So a brief history on the Nazca lines. They are these geoglyphs that were made in the soil in Peru, and they were created between 500 BC and 500 AD, and people just made these intricate designs, and one of the designs actually happens to be a monkey like the one on Carla's plaque. But before Nancy can get to the Nazca lines, they go back to Senor Velez's shop, and it's while they're there that Luis Loaza throws a bomb in there. But right before he does that, Nancy found these letters that were incriminating Loaza and this hollowed out silverware with white powder inside it. So my mind instantly went to drugs, but apparently it is quinine, I believe is how you say it, and it's a drug that can treat malaria. But not only that, but Luis Loaza has been getting this wood from the Ariana's forest illegally, so he's just an all-around bad guy. But can we talk about Senor Velez for a second? Like, I'm sorry, if you see white powder somewhere, don't go lick it up. Like, that's the dumbest thing you can do. And just the fact that he started to do that and Nancy had to stop him, I was just like, oh my gosh, it's not sugar from a powdered donut. Like, just don't. So anyways, we eventually get to the Nazca lines, and we start to dig at the monkey's tail, because we've figured that much out from this plaque. And Luis Loaza, who turns out to be El Gato, the cat, parachutes down, and everyone fights. So just imagine, if you will, all these people at the Nazca lines with shovels, and then George is doing judo, and they're all like just attacking each other after they've parachuted down, and it's so bad. It's so bad. But the police do show up and arrest the bad guys, so there is that. And then, do you want to know what the treasure is? So the treasure is Aguilar's body, which is Carla's great, I don't know, some kind of relative. And they do find some gold and a picture that he apparently sketched or painted of what Machu Picchu used to look like. Woohoo. Like, I don't know, after all the bombs and the fights and all these mishaps, like, it just kind of was a letdown to me. So up next for the What's Cookin' segment of this podcast, Hannah Gruen made some chocolate frosted applesauce cake and milk while Nancy was in River Heights. And then the girls ate corn on the cob with Swiss cheese once they got down to South America. That sounds kind of good, and I kind of want to try that. Now, as for the things that I said that Nancy could add to her resume, I said champion diver. She dove right in after that plaque without hesitation when it went into the Muskoka River. And then she's a ruin raider. I mean, she's climbing all over these ruins. She jumps off of them when that paint can gets thrown at her. She has no respect for historical sites. Now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the clue in the crossword cipher. So I said I liked the plaque and the details of this mystery. They were very interesting at first. I did enjoy that it was a 300-year-old plaque. That was pretty cool. And Bess Marvin is so brave at different parts in this book. She saves Carla from being abducted. She saves the plaque from being stolen from the room. Like, she was really brave in this book. And as for the things I didn't like, this book just kind of started to drag for me, and I felt like the plaque, there could have been more done with that. I mean, we carried this thing around for chapters and chapters of this book, and it was really only valuable for a certain amount of time. Like, I feel like it should have revealed something else to us, you know? So my overall book rating for The Clue in the Crossword Cipher is 1 magnifying glass. I really didn't enjoy this book, and for the cover being so memorable, I thought that the book would be way better than it actually was. So this one is not a favorite of mine. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the Spider Sapphire mystery. That'll be episode number 50, which is crazy. But if you like synthetic jewels with spiders in them and safaris in Africa, you're really going to like this one. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.